Welcome to Inside Human Capital, presented by ConnexPartners and Sabretooth.
Hi, and welcome to the C-Suite Edge. I'm your host, John Light. I'm the president, founder, CEO, and probably chief cook and bottle washer at Sabretooth Recruiting. And I'm really lucky today, and I'm lucky for a couple of reasons, to have Gary Glandon, the very recently retired CPO, Chief People Officer of Lithia Motors, which is a massive organization all over the country, to join me today. And Gary, thanks so much for carving out the time, because it seems like even in retirement, you're still a pretty busy fella.
Yeah, I sure am, John. Great to see you again. Yeah, really happy to be here.
Awesome, man. I'm glad to have you here because, when we did our kind of pregame and we're talking about this, I know one of the areas that you focus now that you've quote unquote retired is in kind of that executive development, strategic advisory space, not just for Lithia, but for others. And I know in particular that succession planning is a passion for you, an interest that I think a lot of companies don't get right. And, I'm hoping that we'll be able to spend some time talking about it, but to kind of lay the foundation for it first, maybe you could take a minute or two and give us a rundown of your career path and what brought you to the point that you're at today.
Yeah, great, John. Happy to. So I started my career after graduating from Michigan State. I was recruited to Phillips Petroleum. So I went from Detroit, the auto business, to the oil business, kind of related a little bit.
Very related.
Spent some time down there. So most of my career has been with pretty large publicly traded companies. Phillips Petroleum, Abbott Labs, Honeywell.
Hmm.
I worked for a lot, those are all international companies. I also worked for Rogers, which is more to B2B company, which is also internationally. We have international facilities. And so I've traveled a lot internationally.
Hmm.
And recently, of course, I worked for Lithia Motors. And Lithia is very similar, who people that don't know it, it's very similar to AutoNation, only
Hmm.
bigger. So we have 450 dealerships across the UK and North America, about 31,000 employees, about $40 billion
Wow.
in revenue. I have worked for a couple non-public companies, but mostly have been public
Hmm.
companies. Been a liaison to the board, worked with 5 different boards, 5 different CEOs, seen all kinds of types and styles. So that's a little bit of my background, just a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, well, Cliff Notes for sure. I mean, you're talking about some heavyweights, and I can't imagine. I've been overseas and driven in countries that drive on the wrong side of the road. And so I can't imagine having dealerships over there and here. I mean, you ever mess something up and send the wrong steering wheel location, you got a problem. Um, I'm really curious to find out, uh, you know, talking about succession planning, I've always had this notion about it that there's a lot of lip service paid towards it. So you get in the C-suite and man, we've got to have, successors lined up. And in everyone's mind, there's this trail of dominoes in the org chart that when the first domino gets taken off the board, the others just collapse right into the right place. And it's never that pretty and simple, number one, because the idea of it, almost the theory of it becoming the practice of it is a real challenge. And I'm hoping that in this conversation today, you can share with us the theoretical side as well as the practical side of actually not just thinking about it and writing it down, but actually executing a good succession plan.
Yeah, sure, John. I think, as you said, it's a big buzzword a lot of people use. But it is a little bit like the chicken and the pig to breakfast, right? Are you participating in it? Or are you committed to it? And there's a big difference. A lot of people are participating. They lay eggs and they'll talk all day about succession planning. And they're actually pretty good with the process, but it's way more holistic than that, right? It's not about just filling out forms. I probably learned it initially when I was at Gateway because I had executives there who came from PepsiCo. And so, they used it a little bit. I probably really honed in the process side, with the Honeywell GE model. with the whole 9 block and the whole piece that leads into succession planning. And, once again, I think there's commitment to the process. I think I really understood the process almost to the point where you would nitpick periods and
Mhm.
what exactly was said and where the positioning was in the 9 box to a point where it just got ridiculous. But then when it came down to somebody would leave the company, we would just go through the process. Somebody would leave the company and they call me and say, "Hey, who should we put in this job?" And we just spent a month going through succession planning. So we did the process, but we weren't committed to it. And
Mhm.
I think the differences that I've seen and what I've tried to instill is not only the process, but the commitment, and it's holistic, right? I mean, you have to go back to, first of all, what is your business strategy? Where are you headed as an organization? And what type of people and executives in particular? Because at my level, you're looking at maybe the top 100, top 150 people, right? You should
Mhm.
be doing it at all levels. Don't get me wrong. Succession planning, we pushed down to all levels at Lithia, but I was responsible for the top 100 and 150 people. Couple things. One is I should know them. And I should have seen them in meetings. I should be able to opine on what I think they're good at and not good at. I think at the end of the day, the CEO is responsible for talent management. They have to own it. They have to buy into it. But the HR person is the main referee, and has to really understand and be a voice of reason. I've seen situations where, take the 9 box, for instance, they'll put people in box 1, which in most cases is your top box, because the CEO likes the person.
Mhm.
But the CEO spent 5 minutes with the person and you spent 5, 10, 15, 20 hours seeing them in meetings. And that's where the HR person has to put a little reality and integrity into the process. So I think it's not just filling out the forms. It's about, do you really know the individuals? Do you really understand where your business strategy is headed? Do you really understand the type of executives that you need? Do you really understand the type of culture that they need to fit in? One of the things that I've seen that's really interesting and where the integrity comes in and that you really have to be harsh on is, does performance trump behavior? So,
There's gotta be
and
limits around that.
totally. In a lot of cases, behavior isn't factored in. So in the 9 boxes at some companies, I changed one of the axes to behavior, right? So it's not what are you doing, but how are you doing it, right? We had a lot of cases of great performer, terrible approach, burning out people, chewing out people, lots of turnover. And in some cases, those people would be actually put in a higher box because they performed. They got results, but they weren't real true successors because when it came down to the job was open, people would say, well, they don't behave. We can't handle that type of behavior. Well, that was known all along. You just didn't deal with it. You weren't honest about it. So I think that's where the HR person really has to play a role in this. It's
Mhm.
not all about performance. It's not about what you did. It's about how you did it and
Mhm.
making sure that there's some integrity in that whole process.
It's interesting because you bring up words like that wasn't honest or there's an integrity issue in this. And I try not to conflate honesty and integrity. Integrity to me is consistency, but I think you also need to be consistently honest and know when to ask the right question. So you got to know the right questions to ask. And to your point, behavior is often tolerated. We see it all the time in sales, right? Where you tolerate all kinds of behavior because there's production, there's results. Um, but to your point, promoting people who aren't aligned with how we need to go about getting those results. Man, that could be the kiss of death, I think, in an organization because the how you go about getting stuff done to me relates to culture, and you can poison it really quick there. But I got a couple of questions just from listening right now, not even factoring in the pregame conversation.
Yeah.
I wrote down questions that are different from what I had in mind coming into this. Okay. But one of the things you mentioned was, the CEO has to be the leader when it comes to talent management? And when I look at talent management, I think really I'm thinking from A to Z. You know, they don't have to be involved in each letter of the alphabet, but
Right.
there has to be a level of leadership by example, not just by committing you to do it,
Right.
displayed by that CEO. And to me, that is an integrity issue, i.e., are you consistently putting your money where your mouth is, so to
Right.
speak? And
Yep.
so I'm curious, what are your thoughts around what if the CEO's not committed enough in practice, just in theory, just he being the chicken and not the pig, as you put it earlier?
Yeah, I think, well, and that's where you need to have an honest conversation with the CEO. And that's where my role
Mhm.
comes in, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're working for a CEO who's not committed to talent management, you may be working for the wrong CEO. I mean,
Mhm.
you go back to Jack Welch and way back, and a lot of people will tell you if you don't get the right people on the bus, strategy doesn't matter. If you don't
Right.
create the right culture, strategy doesn't matter. You
Mhm.
know, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
There's
And
Peter
so
Drucker popping up.
exactly. So
Yeah.
if you have a CEO is not committed, and you can't change their mind, that's a whole different discussion, right?
Yeah.
But in general, I think most CEOs understand that. I really do. I'm more positive. It's not all of them, but most of them get that if I don't have good people in these roles, we're in trouble.
Yeah. We're
And so
toast.
getting their commitment is pretty important. Getting their they have blind spots though, and that's where my role comes in, right? Because
Mhm.
they get enamored with people. They get a snippet of data around and say, "Wow, this person's really good," and you're like, "Well,
Mhm.
wait a minute. Well, here's other things that have happened. Here's what their people say. Are you using 360 feedback to get a more holistic view of that person?" That's where you
Mhm.
got to make sure that the process is bigger than just you filled out the paperwork and you have people, that are ready now. Are they really ready now? And if somebody really got hit by the beer truck or won the lottery, would you actually honestly put that person in the job? And you'd be surprised. A lot of cases you get, no, I wouldn't, right? The,
Mhm.
the, the other thing that's important, and you and I talked a little bit in our pre-meeting, is I think it's really important for someone in my role and even the CEO to have some people externally in mind, especially as you
Mhm.
look at the C-suite, right? Because you don't know what could happen. You could have a huge deflection and you could have somebody not in a ready now box. So somebody wins the lottery, they leave, and there's nobody ready now, right? There's 1 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years. And then you have to make the decision, do you stretch them and take
Mhm.
that risk? Or do you have some candidates externally that you've kind of vetted or used as a search firm to vet that you're familiar with or familiar with your company that you can also reach out to? So I think that's part of the process. Do you put them in the box, or on a form? No, you keep them in your back pocket. Do you mention them to the board as, hey, we also have external people we would look at? I think you do. I think it's important that you do. So I think that is part of the process. It's not just strictly all internal people, but a few external people that you might be able to tap.
Yeah, no, I think that's just prudent, it's being prepared. It kind of leads me to this other question that came to mind, because you talked about at Lithia, you were responsible when it came to direct succession planning for what, 150 people, and you had to be familiar with them. How important are interpersonal relationships in succession planning?
They're extremely important. I mean, our culture was a relationship culture,
Hmm.
right? So, and actually, John, if you said, Gary, of all the people that have failed at the C-suite level, how many failed because of competency and how many failed because they weren't a culture fit? Most of them failed because they were not a culture fit,
Yeah.
right? They got into the job and their behavior that you didn't weed out ruled the day and it didn't work. And
Hmm.
those people failed, right? To find that a C-suite person is not competent is super rare. But to find that they're not a culture fit or you didn't correct their behavior as they were moving through the system,
Hmm.
those are the things that will bite you. It's that culture fit that's huge. So I think it's important for the CEO and the HR person to understand what type of behavior is important. What do they want to see? Not only results, but how they want people treated as part of the process. And once again, be honest about, does that person meet that criteria or did they not meet that criteria? It doesn't mean they're a throwaway. Might mean they need a coach. Might need them, they need exposure to other things. They may need a few things that can, tweak them a bit to make them acceptable. But some may be a no-go, that, their behavior is what it is, and they're not going to progress beyond where they're at.
Yeah,
And you have to
becomes a
be
limiting
honest with
factor.
them. Yep. You have to be honest with them and say, listen, unless your behavior increases, you're not going anywhere. And if they leave you, that's okay too.
Yeah. And I imagine the first couple times or so that you have that conversation, or being honest and telling somebody, look, we're missing some cultural alignment. I'm sure that's not a very pleasant experience.
Yeah.
But at the same time, some of the most useful, some of the highest utility we have in relationships are with people who will tell us the hard thing. Now, that doesn't mean they're beating you up with it, beating you over the head with a stick, so to speak, but they are saying, hey, look, this is what's going on. I remember a conversation I had years ago. I just joined a company and I was having some friction with our IT person. Now, this is back, okay, truth here. This is back in the day when we had an AS400 in the office. Okay. This is going back a while.
They were huge.
Oh, man. So we're having some friction, and it was a personality thing. And, my boss pulled me aside and said, look, I don't know if this is going to work out if you can't fix this relationship. You need this person.
Yeah.
We've got 50, 60,000 invoices a month going out from this shop, and you're responsible for it. And if you don't have this person aligned with you, then it's not going to work out. So immediately went to work on fixing that relationship, not by snuggling up to them or anything like that, but just by being pragmatic and making sure I made sure that they had what they needed, so I could get what I needed for my team and our goals and this sort of thing. It was for me, it was a hard conversation, but I also recognized it as an opportunity. And I may not have liked what I was told. I didn't mind how he did it. Jeff was actually really good about it. He put his arm on my shoulder and we walked out to the shop and into the lot. And he was like, hey, look. And it was matter of fact, it wasn't critical in the way that it felt to me emotionally, but how it hit me in the cerebral part of my mind. The part is like, well, wait a second. I recognize red flag. I have an opportunity to correct. And I did. I was promoted 5-6 months later. And in part because I handled that business, because somebody was kind enough to be honest in a pleasant way, I suppose. Because if you're not helping that person improve, I'd make the argument that, and you think it's being kind because, well, they'll figure it out eventually. I would argue that that's bordering more or leaning more towards cruelty, because you're denying them the opportunity to improve. And that's not saying we need to nitpick, but it is saying when you have a chance to help someone, especially from an executive leadership position, this is a person who has the potential to replace you, but they need some polishing, some fine tuning. You got to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think you're dead on. I'll give you examples. I remember I think my first supervisory job where I had a group of people, I was 25 years old. And I had a person, and she worked for me, and she was brilliant, but she had what I would call a fatal flaw. And so I brought her in for her performance review. And honestly, I was up all night. I didn't know how she would take it. I was really nervous. I had a box of tissue on my desk. I told her,
for you or for her?
For both. So I said, Debbie, you're really good. Here's the things that you're really good at. But there's one thing that you need to correct if you want to get promoted. And it is a fatal flaw if you don't correct it. And John, for a second, there was dead silence. I'm like, oh, here we go. I was ready to grab a tissue. And she looked at me and said, Gary, I worked here for 10 years. No one's ever said that. And I know exactly what you mean. And I'll tell you what, at that, the light popped on. It's like, I
Yeah.
will always be honest with my feedback because not only is it unkind, it's actually selfish, right? You're actually avoiding, a conflict or what you think may be a conflict, which is a
Mhm.
selfish viewpoint versus I'm going to give this person honest information. Whether they do anything or not with it is not your issue.
Yeah, that's on them.
That's on them. But to not do it is just not what good leaders should be doing.
Yeah. Let me change the topic just a little bit. And I know we're going past time for just a minute or two, but I think this is an important question. Let me set the table. About 3 years ago, we ran a survey of 50 CHROs, and we asked them when it came to talent acquisition, what their biggest gripes from their internal customers were. Well, one, and you hear this all the time, it's pretty ubiquitous. Your recruiters don't understand our technical needs. But right there with it, what was really interesting is that your recruiters don't understand our business. And we mentioned earlier, you mentioned business strategy context and how that's got to help shape and guide succession planning. And I'm curious, when you're sitting in the human capital space, CPO, CHRO, whatever, you're sitting in that space. A lot of people don't necessarily look at that from the outside looking in as like, well, you couldn't go sell this, you couldn't do F&I, you couldn't, manufacture that or do this add-on or whatever. And, what I've found is the people who are very successful in the space view themselves as business professionals who just happen to be really experienced or really good in human capital per se. So I'm curious from the perspective of how important is it when you do succession planning to truly align with the business, the long-term business strategy, and really understand how do we generate revenue? How do we bring profitability? How do we add value?
Yeah. Excellent point. And you're preaching to the choir because I am a big believer and you have to understand the business, not only for succession planning, but just for credibility. And so I require my HR people, they better understand the business. And guess what? People will take the time to spend time with you to understand the business. I required it of my recruiters, I required it of my HR managers, I require it at every level. Let me give you an example. So in the UK, we had a critical opening in our operations group. You
Mhm.
know who they put in charge of operations till we could find somebody? The HR person. No joke. And that was a manufacturing facility, right? I mean, it was complex. You know why? She understood the business. So
Awesome.
it is critical. If you don't have HR people that literally can step into the role for a
Mhm.
period of time and have people comfortable with it. I asked the CEO one time, I said, would you be more comfortable with me being the president of the division or the president of the division running HR? He said, oh my God, I'd rather have you be the president of the division. Which I did that on purpose, right? I wanted to
Uh,
make sure that he felt in my role, I understand how to run the business. So it is imperative. And actually, I'll be honest, John, I think our function has done a horrible job of really emphasizing the need to understand the business. And when I mean understand the business, if you can't sit down with the CFO and really debate KPIs on an executive comp plan or any comp plan or any analysis, you got a problem.
yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's super important. And so not only succession planning, but if I'm going to have credible HR people that they're going to actually call and say,
Mhm.
I got a business issue, they're not picking up the phone if you don't understand the business. What I
Yeah, if
want
they
to
don't
hear
believe
is
you understand it.
exactly. They know the HR person knows what keeps them up at night.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because we've covered a lot of territory. Let's be frank. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. If and I know that you, since you're quote retired, such as it is, I know you do a lot of executive coaching and succession planning and help executive teams out. If someone wants to connect with you and dive deeper, what's the best way for them to find you and get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if they're connected with you on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. My profile's there. It's easy to get a hold of me there. I have a website. It's called glandonpartners.com. You can look at my website. It's kind of a business card, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And you can contact me at gland23@yahoo.com. Just send me an email. Tell me what you're interested in. It's funny. People say, I think you're busier now that you're retired than you were when you were working.
I have a friend who retired 35 years at Shell, and he told me point blank, he says, I'm running faster now than I did in the last 35 years.
Yeah, I don't know how I had time to fit work in, to be honest.
Gary, thank you for sharing your time and experience today, man. I'm really indebted. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Inside Human Capital, presented by ConnexPartners and Sabertooth.